everyone. My name is Sanjyot Mehendale, for those who don't know me. I'm the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies and also teach Central Asian art and archaeology at Berkeley. And I want to welcome you to today's lecture. Now, before introducing our speaker, a quick announcement. Our final lecture of the semester will take place on May 6th, featuring Imre Galambas of Zhejiang University on the production of Buddhist scrolls in Dunhuang. And looking ahead to the fall, we will host a conference, Tang Music in Contemporary China, Sensing Artistry Through Time, which has been organized by one of our wonderful graduate students, Gus Hawley, who is in ethnomusicology. This event will take place October 8th to 10th, and it's co-sponsored by the Townsend Center for the Humanities, the Dunhuang Foundation, and UC Berkeley's Music Department. So please check out our website over the summer for additional details. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Petya Andreeva. She's a scholar of pre-modern East and Central Asian art and material culture with a focus on cross-cultural exchange along Afro-Eurasian trade networks. In other words, the movement of objects and visual languages across borders. She received a BA from Colby College and a Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania. Her interdisciplinary research spans topics from Chinese funerary art and Central Asian archaeology to nomadic metalwork, fantastic beasts, as you may all know, and Mongol-era patronage, with a particular interest in how migration, trade routes, and frontier regions shape visual culture. Her first book, Fantastic Fauna, From China to Crimea, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2024, explores the spread of animal imagery across Eurasia and highlights the role of nomadic societies in shaping a connected past. She has also edited in 2023 Zoomorphic Arts of Ancient Central Eurasia, and she's of course also published widely in leading journals. Her work has been supported by major fellowships, including a UNESCO Silk Road Research Grant and a Getty ACLS Fellowship. And she's traveled extensively, lectured extensively. This year, I think it was particularly intense, traveling all across China, Mongolia, and also Central Asia. So today, that's another thing. Dr. Andreeva works in multiple languages and has conducted extensive field work across China and Central Asia. She works in Chinese, Russian, Mongolian, among others. Before joining Vassar College, where she's a professor today, she taught at Parsons School of Design in New York. So today she will speak on the politics of zoomorphic art at the porous borders in China and Central Asia. So please help me welcome Dr. Petya Andreeva.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for welcoming me here in Berkeley. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the Tang Center for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and also thank you so much for joining me on Wednesday afternoon at what I presume is one of the busiest times of the semester, so I really appreciate it. So the research that I would like to share with you today comes out of my first book, Fantastic Fauna, From China to Crimea, but some of the themes, hypotheses, and visual materials that I will be speaking about have sort of led me to future avenues of inquiries that I haven't necessarily talked about or developed fully or refined in my first book. And so I'm very much looking forward to your comments, feedback, and questions at the end. So a little bit more about zoomorphism and why I'm interested in it. I thought I should perhaps sort of outline the three major avenues of inquiry that I'm pursuing in my book, but also in my larger body of work, because they will be some of the underlying threads that really unify that diverse visual material that I will feature today. So firstly, I'm interested in the dissemination of objects, ideas, and especially aesthetic values and design patterns. More specifically, I'm fascinated by what ecological, political, economic, but even psychological factors might enable some design tropes and idioms to travel swiftly across vast distances whilst others don't really catch on far beyond their birthplace. What's behind that, right? And so in the case of nomadic societies, as I find out, some of those factors can be easily uncovered. I'm also interested in sort of reversing the assumption that still exists in the history of art, particularly in the histories of art that study Eurasian antiquity, that images usually travel from the monumental to the portable, not the other way around. As we find in particularly interesting hotspots for exchange on the so-called Silk routes, particularly the Eurasian steppe network that sort of predates them, it is often the case, in fact, that designs featured or embedded on small objects, such as jewelry, in fact made it to larger constructions or to architecture. And so that being the case, we can then rethink some of the preoccupations of the canon, or the Eurocentric canon in particular, with monumentality and sedentism. And so zoomorphism, as I found to be the case in my research, has really a vast epistemological potential. How so? As we'll see, hopefully I will convincingly show that is the case in my talk, there is a certain underlying logic in zoomorphic design that's very particular and very unique to non-sedentary societies that actually also helps us revisit the history of monsters or the dissemination of composite imagery in Eurasian antiquity, and also helps us defy common narratives that are rooted in the legacy of classical humanism, that presume a certain centrality of the human image, human anatomy, or human bodies and experience in image making. When in fact Chinese design, but also nomadic design in different ways, were in fact zoomorphic, primarily zoomorphic, from their very inception. And they remained so for a long period of time. So here in this talk I ask, how did these convergent notions or penchant for zoomorphism in fact result in a certain otherness or a certain alterity that then defined the relationship between China and the perennial barbaric other, the so-called steppe nomad? So I argue that zoomorphic design is in fact in many ways at the heart of this relationship. And so thirdly, I'm interested in, of course, the political dimensions of all of it. I will argue that, in fact, that zoomorphic spectacle that was constructed and directed in funerary performances had very specific political dimensions and was part of a bigger political agenda, particularly in nomadic societies. I suggest, before we delve into the visual materials at hand, I suggest that we briefly talk about the topographical, ecological, and of course environmental parameters in question. Naturally, those will be central to zoomorphic design, which is rooted in a very particular approach to animal anatomy, so inverting and fragmenting those animal anatomies. So it is important to know where we are in time and space and who are the political actors that we are trying to center. So I invite you to look at this region in particular, what's underlined in light green here. And this is the so-called Eurasian steppe belt, or the Eurasian steppe that some refer to as the precursor to the so-called Silk Roads, which is, of course, as we know, a convoluted term with a questionable legacy. But it's a 5,000 miles expanse, so it's a very expansive territory that we're dealing with. And so it stretches from the Mongolian-Manchurian grassland to the east all the way to, of course, Crimea and the Pontic-Caspian steppes, north of the Black Sea, but in fact all the way to the central Hungarian plain over here. So dividing this is a little bit challenging, but if we speak, if we think of it in terms of archaeological cultures, but also climate and environmental conditions, we are inevitably going to come up with three classifications or three divisions. The eastern steppe, which mostly overlaps with the so-called northern Chinese periphery that we will discover is rather fluid. You have the central steppe, which encompasses primarily the Kazakh steppe or the Kazakh uplands. And then you have the Pontic-Caspian or the western steppe north of the Black Sea. A huge segment of it is Ukraine or eastern Ukraine. A lot of those artifacts have been found in what is now eastern Ukraine. So overall, this region was inhabited by non-sedentary societies starting from around the year 700 BCE. Now, they adopted different degrees of pastoralism, but for the most part, these societies formed loose confederations that had a very different relationship with domesticated animals than their agrarian neighbors. And this is really key here, because I will argue that because of their structured movements, which were seasonal, they were not random movements, they were not roaming around, as many romanticized, sensualized narratives would have you believe, those structured movements and that psychology of structured mobility and the exposure, semi-annual exposure to different ecosystems, in fact resulted in a particular approach to animal bodies, to animal anatomies that you would never see in their agrarian sedentary neighbors. The methodological issue with studying these societies, well, there are many methodological issues, but the major one that I have identified in my own body of work is the fact that they are often referred to through different ethnonyms, so exonyms that are either retroactively applied to them or they appear in the narratives or ethnographies created by their geopolitical enemies, such as Samachien in China, of course, Herodotus, Ctesias, Pliny the Elder, the list is long on the Greco-Roman side. Persian inscriptions in Persepolis also mention them, but usually they refer to through blanket exonyms that mean very little and reveal even less about the actual historical realities at hand and the way they collectively refer to themselves. So Scythians, Saka, Xiongnu, Eastern Hu, and so on and so forth, some of the exonyms in place. Now, the visual materials at hand, I hope you'll be convinced, actually show us that more often than not, we're dealing with incredibly culturally, politically, and, well, culturally and ethnically diverse confederations and alliances of groups that were unified they were unified by a specific bonding mechanism, and that was a shared geopolitical enemy, namely China, Persia, and Greece, and shared economic and geopolitical interests, usually rooted in the challenges of pastoralism. And so I will argue that zoomorphism helps us understand that collective building. Okay. So these are representative examples of the objects that you would see coming out of the tombs and hoards that are dispersed across this vast terrain that I just showed on the map. There are, of course, methodological challenges, blind spots, lacunas associated with studying them. So I thought maybe I should shine a light on some of them so that we can understand how the field has developed, but also not necessarily developed in studying these cultures. So first of all, the term animal style that is often applied to some of these materials was really coined, or I should say popularized, by Mikhail Rostovtsev at the beginning, the dawn of the 20th century, and he was a social historian. This is key here because he invented the term mostly as a concession to collectors and museum curators, but especially collectors on the rather problematic at the time antiquities market. And so what do I mean by concession? People needed to classify this material, these portable, valuable gold objects that were now coming into the market, but they didn't quite fit with any of the pre-established archetypes in Eurasian antiquity. For example, China, Persia, Greece, or any other of the well-known sedentary political actors. To this day, this is a huge problem in curatorial work, in curatorial studies, I must say, after having had many conversations with museum curators, including on Saturday at the Met. Simply because Central Asia, the Eurasian steppe, in the museum, the art world, continues to be sort of a recycling station for the inexplicable, for the unclassifiable, for all that visual material that defies a swift, easy, straightforward designation under one of the convenient archetypes. And that problem was especially egregious back then, right? So that's where the story of animal style begins. It starts with the antiquities market with objects that were not provenanced, and that's important. So I invite you to look at these in particular, right? So the one to the left here, okay, this one is one of 240 gold objects that are part of the Peter the Great's Siberian collection. that is featured in the Gold Room of the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Now, none of those 240 objects came into the Tsar's possession through legal excavations, through scientifically authenticated venues. In fact, after the looting that happened there, he commissioned Prince Gagarin in Siberia to institute a new law there and make everybody who finds anything in their backyard turn this over, and then it entered the imperial treasury ultimately. So this is important because we don't know how these objects would have been arranged within the spatial parameters of the tomb. So that original curatorial schema, whether they, the relationship between these objects and the body, the way they stood on the body, the way they activated the body, the relationship between that personal adornment and the audience, all of that is lost to us. We can only guess. Now, the same applies, in fact, to the object that you see here, which comes from a similar group, the so-called Ordos bronzes, who are those mostly in Mongolia, but the larger region of Ordos in the bend of the Yellow River in North China. So this object in particular, the Tang Museum collection, amongst many, many, many museums in North America, has 501 of these. People rarely mention it or know about it, but it's true. 501 of these. No one knows which tomb they came from. I know a lot about, the way in which they came into the collection, and it's mostly through dealers and collectors, at the beginning of the 20th century. And once again, we will never know what the original curatorial or adornment schema inside the tomb was. And so this becomes a Herculean challenge. And throughout the 20th century, most studies of these objects have really been preoccupied with finding the so-called birthplace of animal style. Can we pinpoint a specific region on this 5,000 miles expanse, whether it is the so-called Near East or West Asia, whether it is China, whether it is somewhere in between in that enigmatic region of Central Asia that nobody has quite defined. But more often than not, the studies have not necessarily delved into this material for its theoretical or epistemological value. They have studied it for the sake of identifying it. And so what I am arguing here is that these avenues are not really prolific, that in fact they're detrimental to developing this research further. And so what I am instead is that we look at the so-called animal style, again, a term that was really a concession to collectors to make money, that we look at it, in fact, through the lens of visual language or shared visual rhetoric. And so here I will break down this visual material that is indeed overwhelming, looking at shared visual tropes or shared design idioms, which I think are productive terms to use here and that can help us closer to a more concrete analysis of these objects. So, okay, well, in fact, I invite you to look at this particular piece. So the first trope that I would argue is the most omnipresent, the most ubiquitous, widely present across each and every microzone on the Eurasian steppe is this one, what I refer to as a mixture of visual synecdoches on overall pars pro toto mode of expression. That is to say, a reliance on the metonymic mode of expression, where different species are reduced to their signature anatomical part in a rather economic representation. So over here, this was excavated at Aluch Haidang, a pretty famous excavation, but this particular species is really a hodgepodge of different anatomical incongruities, if you look at it closely, right? So maybe we have the body of a predator, a feline predator of some kind with a menacing jaw, and very sharp claws, so the predatory nature of the beast becomes apparent, but then the body transitions into deer antlers, which then in turn terminate into bird heads or raptor heads in profile. The second thing that's happening here, interestingly, a transposition and abbreviation. Let me qualify these fancy terms that I've used. Well, for example, with the tail here, the presumed tail, in fact transforms into a bird's head. So the part-whole relation, the ontological part-whole relations here are disrupted. Ideation on the part of the viewer is also prevented and disrupted at first. And so that happens quite a lot, where certain anatomical parts are either copy and pasted, so to speak, onto one another, or they exist in a constant state of flux or mutability. These are the species that we speak of, right? And one cannot help but wonder whether that may have something to do with consistent exposure, in fact, to different species, but also, more importantly, a larger or higher reliance on animals than you would observe necessarily in sedentary societies. So certainly a metonymic mode of expression, but also a very crowded, abbreviated organism of sorts. Now, I argue, and this I'm very confident about, having examined thousands of these. At some point I started having dreams about them. This specific trope, this specific subtrope, if you will, the bird deer antwer, as I call it, or the syncretic antwer motif, was in fact incredibly transferable. The other thing that I'm interested in methodologically again is what travels and what doesn't travel, what is disseminated and transmitted properly and what isn't. Well, this is disseminated rather successfully because we do see it cross not only geographical boundaries but also material boundaries. So in both cases, we have different variants, different regional and local variants of the so-called syncretic antwer trope. You see it here to the left. This particular one is also from Argos, that particular cultural zone, a zone in the bend of the Yellow River. Deer antlers terminating into those familiar heads, the stylized raptor heads, but also the beak once again, right? Is sort of a raptor's beak, and then maybe there are hooves here. So certainly this syncretism, this hodgepodge of different anatomical parts is present here as well. And again, this one in particular is now in the British Museum, unprovenanced, which poses the question how to study things that we know came out of tombs alongside objects that just appear in museum collections, but we can't reconstruct their original placement in the tomb. It's something I continue to struggle with, in fact. But here you see doe heads perhaps emerging out of the back of the animal, which is sort of violently twisted, right? There are these dramatic yet static depictions of animals. Now, to really prove my previous point, I would like to just show you these. So here we have evidence of the transferability of this particular syncretic antwer motif across media and modes of making. So in this particular instance, we have the Pacific equestrian culture who were active in the Altai Mountains, the Siberian Altai. So the Altai Mountains served as sort of a natural barrier sometimes to dissemination because they're mountains, right? That sort of cross the Eurasian steppe. But in this case, you have a little bit of leather here, but mostly wood. Right? That's the material. So you have a less noble material. And so there isn't really a relationship between the nobility of the material used, or the value of the object itself, and then the trope used. These tropes were incredibly transferable across techniques, media, and modes of making. And this one in particular has a completely different function. Not only is it made of bronze, but it's a terminal of some kind with bells significantly bigger than the other ones, and it comes from a different region, the northern Caucasus, the domain of the so-called early Pontic Scythians, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that this particular motif, the deer-bird antwer motif, was in fact able to travel and was in fact just incredibly ubiquitous across time and space. But the rare examples that haven't really been discussed, that I luckily uncovered, the one to the right, I uncovered because it's from my home country, so just randomly in the museum I saw this. But these two are matrices, they're modes. Right? So most of the objects that we find on the steppe were not sold wholesale. They were commissioned for specific patrons, usually members of the highest echelons of the nomadic elite, the so-called super elite, as I call them. But here, that narrative is slightly disrupted because we have objects that help us render many images, right? I don't know if I feel comfortable calling this mass production, but they certainly help us reproduce more than one image. And interestingly, they come from the two polar opposite ends of the Eurasian steppe. The one to the left here, in fact, does come from the Ordos, the familiar Ordos zone on the northern Chinese periphery. And guess what? Once again, we see a familiar design idiom, right? So we have the condensed animal body, but we also have the deer, bird, antler motif. Okay, great. So that's produced. What's interesting about this is that it was found actually in a commoner's tomb complex. So this was found in the tomb of a bronze caster. And this bronze caster, it's actually a complex of 23 tombs. And the bronze caster was buried with two types of objects. This, and also other tools that he used for the production of nomadic design and nomadic objects, clearly for the nomadic market, but also Chinese bronzes or tools for the making of Chinese bronzes. So here emerges a tantalizing possibility that casters in China at the time, around the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, was starting to specialize and cater to the needs of two distinct types of clientele. The nomadic market to the north, in which they were trying to buy in, but also then, of course, the imperial capital and the market in China, which had a penchant for bronzes and a different type of zoomorphism. But the delineation between those two types of markets and those two types of customers is important here to consider. The other one we find from a sedentary culture, the culture of the Thracians, really at the edges of the western steppe, mostly in modern-day Bulgaria and southern Romania and parts of northern Greece, but they were an agrarian and agricultural civilization. They were not nomadic. However, they were also catering to two types of clientele. On the one hand, the steppe market, which was becoming more and more alluring to a number of power players in Eurasian antiquity, and also, of course, to Greece. They were producing a lot of Greek-style objects. And so in this particular tomb, you have this mattress. We see the design pattern. I hope it's familiar at this point. You'll probably get sick of it very soon, but it's syncretic antlers, right? Syncretic antlers and the animal bodies, we see what they look like, very consistent with the taste and the expectations of a steppe customer. But there are a number of Greek-style vessels placed inside that site, that tomb. So we have the same phenomenon on polar opposite ends of the steppe, and that's why this particular the omnipresence, but also omnipotence of this syncretic antler motif is rather important. The second design pattern that I think, the importance of which I think has been somewhat exaggerated, frankly, maybe that was too aggressive of a statement, but I will explain why I think so, is the so-called animal combat, if we can even qualify it as such, and I'm a little suspicious of this term. Now, in fact, when Rostovtsev was active and animal style was not really high up on anybody's priorities list at the time when major discoveries in Mesopotamia, such as Ur at the beginning of the 20th century, were being uncovered, the portable arts of the steppes was designated very swiftly under the minor arts category, and still is to some degree. And so at the time, people were sort of equating it with animal style, ignoring the other tropes, simply because there was this narrative that, oh, well, the violent nomads who were raiding the territories around were sort of course, interested in predation. And so that was a very simplistic, one-sided narrative that was put forth. And in many museum catalogs for a long time, animal style was always illustrated through this, right? And indeed, that is the trope that emerges as relevant in almost all of the microzones, but not to the same degree as the one that I just showed you, particularly the syncretic antler. Now, I invite you to look at the variations in this trope because they are important. So over here, we have the Siberian collection of Petya the Great. These are fantastical animals, but it's quite difficult to untangle them, right? However, they're not fully abstracted. They exist somewhere on the edge of cognitive chaos, right? They exist somewhere in between ecological reality and abstraction. You can kind of uncover them, but at some point they lose their contours or anatomical components. But again, because this is a region that was trading with Greece,
right? So we are dealing with the Pontic-Caspian steppe and the so-called Emporia, the Scythian Emporia in the Greek, the Greek Emporia with Scythian tradesmen at the time, so Black Sea colonies of the Greeks. A lot of these objects sort of still retained a suspiciously high level of realism, because it is likely, in fact, that that was the result of their interactions with the Greeks. However, when we look at animal combat elsewhere, we see that more often than not, we still see a combination, in fact, of this particular trope featured alongside, well, guess what, the bird, deer, antler motif, once again. And so one of the things that we observe, one of the interesting phenomena, is that when we're dealing with a member of the true elite nucleus, not mid-ranking warriors, because that difference is essential and is not often made. When we're dealing with a member of that very small yet negotiable elite nucleus in these loose nomadic confederations, you see not only gold, but you actually see objects with particularly abstruse designs that combine more than one of these design idioms. And I think that's very consequential, actually. Because we often think of status being defined purely in terms of the quantities of gold, but that's not always the case. Okay, so over here, we saw two images that are still relatively, they retain a certain level of realism, of faithfulness to ecological reality. When we move further east and go to any space within the northern Chinese periphery, however, that reality changes, and we actually start to see a higher degree of abstraction and stylization. And the image here sort of proves that, because it is very, very difficult to untangle and identify and pinpoint these animal bodies at first. Here, upon a seriously concerted effort, you might be able to identify the body parts of snakes, maybe here, and then the beaks of a bird. But the animals are so concocted, so intertwined, that they quickly lose their taxonomical credibility or anatomical accuracy, and that's incredibly, incredibly common on the northern Chinese periphery, where in fact many of these objects, particularly the one here, were actually produced by imperial workshops in China and then dispatched or sent to the northern market, right? And so we look at certain convergent notions of zoomorphism that already existed in China and were then transferred to the nomadic market. And so that's why the so-called animal combat, animals interacting with each other, predating or not predating into each other, shouldn't really be looked at through this one-sided narrative. In fact, it changes visually depending on who are the two commercial partners in place, right? When the nomads are interacting with the Greeks, we inevitably see a high degree of realism, right? And ecological reality is always the stepping stone. When, however, we see that interaction between Chinese makers and nomadic customers or vice versa, we see something like this, which does embrace a larger degree, a high degree of abstraction, and much more abbreviated narratives, sorry. Okay, and the reason why animal combat, I think, hasn't been fully explored so far as a trope is, again, we see that actually in the Thracians, right? We see that one maybe feline biting onto the body of its prey. But what's interesting is looking at West Asia, right? And here we have Persepolis, so the Apadana Palace, as an example. And of course, this is a pretty famous and widely published scene. It may have to do with Persian cosmology. The scene certainly exists in Persian cosmology at the time. But what often isn't being said, actively at least, is that during this time, Darius has conquered a number of Scythians, and that is documented very widely by Herodotus and other historians at the time. And more importantly, it actually overlaps that the fact that he takes on enslaves many prisoners of war who are Scythian and forces them into labor. We don't know exactly what kind of labor, actually overlaps with the construction of this palace. And so if so, the presumed one-directionality of image transfer from the monumental, from this, to the more manageable formats used by the nomads is a little disrupted. Could it be the nomads, the art of whom, or the images of whom predate this, in fact, was transferred the other way around, right? So that's one of the big questions that I'm asking. It needs a little bit more to really argue it, but the dates are really, really suspicious. So the reason why animal combat has been so popularized is because each and every microzone on the steppe has some notion of animal predation in their mythology, spiritual, religious systems. But I think the confusion often is between meaning and function. And that's one of the underlying threads actually in my book. The meaning versus function of imagery, not objects. So indeed, a lot of these tropes could have had various meanings in the different microzones that we discuss. But they had a shared function, and that function was to create a certain collective that defined the nomads as such and as distinct, the distinct other in an increasingly global Eurasian milieu. More on this in just a minute, but I wanted to start the conversation, so to speak, on this. What's interesting is that the other really widely not so widely disseminated trope, that's the last one, is this one. Okay, and the mirrored or reflected animal bodies, or what I call visual parallelism, bilateral symmetry, you know, whatever works for different art historians works here, except we don't have full symmetry, not really, but we have an attempt at bilateral symmetry, and animals usually confront each other, they are reflected twins, so to speak, but there is no evidence always of predation. But the archaeological record of this specific, or evidence of this trope, is very uneven. So we rarely see this actually in the Scythian domain of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. We rarely see this, or seldom, a little bit seldom, yeah, in the central steppe. But we see an explosion of this, in fact, once we move to the northern Chinese periphery. An exception, again, in the central steppe, one of the few examples, is this particular one, right, where you have a textile from the Pazyryk equestrian culture of South Siberia, and yes, you have definitely bilateral symmetry, and then the animal combat also combined with that, right, to create a certain sense of order, to steal Gombrich's term here. But more often than not, and in fact truly more often than not, you see the adoption of this particular axial order, the adoption of that central axis along which we have fully abbreviated, metonymically conveyed animal bodies in the northern Chinese periphery. And the question really becomes why. So we return to this tomb of the so-called Lin Hu, maybe a low fun, but most likely Lin Hu, the so-called forest barbarians, or the forest Hu of the warring states that are mentioned in passing only twice in Chinese chronicles, but they have left behind fascinating materials, mostly these ones here. So all of these would have been dispersed across the body of the tomb occupant, certainly a member of the elite nucleus, not a mid-ranking warrior. And in fact, these feature, right, two combat scenes, sort of, right, but they're very obviously delineated in that way, right, distributed along this vertical axis. Now, the question is, why do we see this influx, this explosion of the bilateral symmetry of this particular trope and not so much the other ones when we look at the northern Chinese periphery? And the answer might be that, as evidenced by the tomb of the Castor that I showed you and other tombs of makers and artisans in northern China, particularly in the Ordos region, that they inscribed with Chinese characters even, that there was which workshop, which year, for whom that was produced, right? So we know that China was actively trying at the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, to buy into the alluring nomadic market. And they did so much more successfully than any of their rivals or power players in Eurasian antiquity. And so I argue that part of it, not the sole reason, but part of it is that China was very comfortable with zoomorphism and a certain level of abstraction, to a degree that psychologically even makers in other parts of the ancient world were not. Certainly not enough to be able to buy into that market swiftly enough. So I just chose these ones, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with ritual bronzes, right, that were produced, that predate what I'm talking about by 1,000 years, right? So an example here, categorically they're not really conceptually that different, right? You have metonymically conveyed probably animal bodies. Here you have a bird's eye view, but you still have that vertical axis. So the idea is that there is an already existing frame of reference. It is through this frame of reference that the tropes of animal style are being interpreted so that they can catch on with that new customer and be actively bought by that customer. So that's what China does that others don't necessarily do as successfully, and it's really a game changer, in fact. So here, this is very brief. I just wanted to show you the full, well, to give you a sense of the full appearance, or the full curatorial schema of that tomb of Alu Chaidang. So let me just do this. So the body would have been covered by all these, okay, and then on the head, there would be a textile that links it. It's not just flying, okay? So at the very top you have the cap with a realistical bird on top, which actually moves because there is a wire within the body. So it moves every time the wearer moves their head. So maybe there is a ritualistic aspect of this. Then the cap itself features animal combat scenes that are embossed onto the gold. And then you have, very interestingly, again, the terminals, maybe feline, some people say wolves. Not really, I think it's a feline, but the terminals themselves, very consistent still with animal style, reduced and then terminating into this braided rope design that's very common on the northern Chinese periphery. But the body becomes visually elongated. And as such, it is in fact incredibly reminiscent, and probably using this as a frame of reference. This is, you know, this particular one is not earlier, but there are earlier ones from this cultural zone. So the so-called golden men, and now we have women also, by the way. So there are 6 that are excavated. One is a woman, from Kazakhstan, from the territory of northern-day Kazakhstan. This is the earliest in 1969, Soviet Kazakhstan, but there are ones that have been made as recently as 7 years ago, COVID time, so maybe 8 years ago. But the body is entirely covered in this case, more than 4,000 different gold adornments. You can once again see a version of that Antwerp motif, except now it's becoming more stylized and more geometricized. You can see it here. But the body is also visually elongated, and there is still this vertical axis, sort of, but it's this emphasis on verticality that the northern Chinese periphery, through this particular meandering aspect of the spiral, is emulating, right? So the frame of reference is, of course, the steppe visual formula, but it is adapted to fit well with already existing skill sets amongst Chinese craftsmen and the visual formula that was already in place in China as well. This is the one that I had in mind when I said that there are Chinese characters on the back of some. So another Ordos zone tomb, and this is a prime example of something that would have exact inscriptions and tell us it was produced indeed in this workshop for the steppe market. And this is actually everything that you see in this particular tomb. And yes, I indeed decided to circle the ones that have consistent frames of reference that we have seen, design tropes that we are familiar with already, right? So you have the central axis, the twin reflected animals happening once again, and we of course have the stylized syncretic Antwerp, just a different version of it throughout the tomb. And this one in particular is also interesting because once again we are returning to Majia-Yuan, and it's again once the same thing, but even closer to the one at Alu Chaidang. So there is the vertical axis in the center, again that centrality, that bilateral symmetry as a design trope, but very interestingly the feline heads, the abbreviated feline heads, look almost identical on each side. So there is something happening at the end of the 4th century BCE, the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, on the northern Chinese periphery, where China starts to be more actively looking at steppe zoomorphism, emulating it, of course, through its own frame of reference, mostly for economic gain. Now, this is actually widely, here we go. This is widely attested in chronicles, so I'm not making it up. In fact, there is enough written evidence to justify this, or what we find in the tombs. So in the same tomb, Manchurian, which is not technically part of the steppes, but it's part of this northern zone that's in between, where the Sirong or the Western Rong are active, we find images like these. A couple of things can be noticed here. First of all, look at the awkward inlay. It's not high quality, right? You would never see that, and that's important. It sounds silly, but it's important because you will never see such insertion anywhere else. So it attests perhaps to the rushed application and production of things wholesale for now a growing market. But more interestingly, look at the reduction of animal parts, how incredibly abstracted the zoomorphism becomes in a way that would be unthinkable, impossible on the Western steppe, closer to Greece, even closer to Persia, where realism is significantly more valued, right? So here we have evidence actually from the records of the Grand Historian, the Shiji, and there is a specific chapter called the Money Makers, and that chapter actually points to a specific individual. He was a stock breeder in this particular region of Manchurian. It actually overlaps exactly, and this stock breeder was actually awarded. He was trading with the Sirong very successfully, so he was the intermediary who was selling them gold, and he was getting domesticated animals at a time when there was an active shortage of them. And so the first emperor of Qin gave him many financial stimuli and awards, and he was celebrated. And there are a couple of guys like that in that chapter that clearly served as intermediaries, helping China buy into that market and bringing, of course, giving China back domesticated animals, in many cases, horses that China could then use for its cavalry. So the exchange between the steppe nomads in China, I think, sometimes is still being sort of romanticized, particularly when we look at visual materials, when in fact even the visual materials such as these are telling us that interaction can be defined as short-lived opportunism and sometimes active hostility, but it never resulted in true reciprocity. They were not just borrowing from each other randomly because they thought it was cool. They were borrowing these because there was a very particular financial interest that each side had, and that's where animal style or studying it becomes very practical. Now, the really uncommon and I would say understudied materials that I find very fascinating here. So, with the advent of the Han Dynasty, and in particular with the formation of the Xiongnu, right? Previously, we've been studying confederations. I wouldn't even call them confederations, loose alliances, right? The Linghu, that are hardly even mentioned. But once we're dealing with the formation of a slightly, well, actually much more centralized and well-organized and powerful confederation, things begin to change. And we start to observe the intrusion or permeation of the so-called animal style further into, well, the Chinese Empire, all the way to central China, and in some cases all the way to the southern periphery, as you will see in a minute. So the objects that you see here, right, the one to the left has a fascinating biography. First of all, it was found from it's a destroyed tomb, so we can't reconstruct much about it. But we know much about this region of Zhushanxian. So what do we know about it in the Shiji and also in the Book of Han, right? We have references to the first serial killer in Chinese history, very uplifting on a Wednesday afternoon, I'm sorry, but Liu Pengli is his name, and he was actually recorded to have killed hundreds of commoners, and he was the nephew of the emperor, and because of this he was allowed to roam free in the night and bully the commoners and kill them for pleasure. Very sadistic guy, but at the end the emperor just couldn't take it anymore. He didn't sentence him to death, but he sent him to this region where a lot of elites were actively being exiled, egregious elites, of course. But is it not interesting that during the same time you find objects such as these that then disappear? Is it possible that in fact a lot of these elites, banished or not, Han elites are starting now to define themselves or their elite status through the conscious inclusion of objects from the steppe in their tombs, in their final resting places, and on their bodies in general, because that would signal a very particular self-fashioning strategy in which there is a sense of governable otherness, right? So elements from the other are being framed or circumscribed into a local frame. That is the monumentality of the Chinese tomb. So they never overshadow the local, the traditional motifs that you expect to see in a Han tomb, but they're there, right, to signal worldliness, to signal this access to a vast network, and especially the ability to control the other by inserting these objects, even physically delimiting them onto the body. We have actually a vast number of them. Just the dissemination now is freer. It reaches different parts of China. This one in particular is actually a female tomb, but there are also ones in this. The Liu clan, of course, that Liu Bang, the same clan that gave rise to the emperor. Well, here we go. We have these abbreviated, inverted animals, different species in this case, but once again, transposition, abbreviation, and pars pro toto at their best, right? They're adopted, they're embraced here as well. And both of these, this one is in the south, right? Central, you can say central China, the south. These are regions and cultural spheres that were incredibly far from the northern zone. And you would not expect to see that prior to the advent of the Xiongnu Empire. To really show you just how far these made it, well, this is the tomb of the Nanyue, the king of Nanyue, an entity which was ultimately, encased or swallowed by the Han. The Han assumed control of it, but for a little while, and that overlaps with the years here, the leader of Nanyue fashioned himself as an emperor, as an independent emperor, right? And we see that from the seals that were found in his final resting place. But the other types of objects that we find there are objects from different centers of production, once again featuring his vast network of connections, his worldliness, his cosmopolitanism, right? Of course. But interestingly, first we have animal-style objects. So it now is almost a given that the access to the perennial barbaric other has to be featured if one is to really fashion themselves as a proper Chinese elite. And then, interestingly, in the garden, the foundations of the garden near the mausoleum are featuring these interesting ornamental bricks that don't quite fit necessarily what you find in Han material culture. The animals are once again abbreviated very suspiciously in a way that can indeed be redolent of the steppe style. So my point is that you see the shocking intrusion of this Sino-steppe visuality in surprising terrain, so surprising cultural spheres very far from the steppe. And this is just my favorite, and this really, to some degree, proves that now this access and the deposition of steppe objects defines one as proper Han elite, because the region that I'm talking about here is in present-day North Korea. And particularly the region, the outskirts of Pyongyang, there are at least, I would say 12 tombs that I'm aware of that feature eclectic inventories, syncretic inventories of traditional Han Dynasty objects. There is some lacquer, there are jades, there are bronzes, yes. So things that we would absolutely expect to see in a Han Dynasty tomb. The layout of the tomb is very consistent with the traditional canonical Han Dynasty tomb as well, and yet, here and there, you have these types of objects, buckles, plaques, portable gold objects that look like this, and they're consistent stylistically and compositionally with the design tropes that we were discussing, yes, except they feature mostly dragons, or they would feature a steppe species interacting or predating or being predated on by a dragon. So now what's interesting is that we once again have the permeation of creatures, mythological or otherwise, that are more consistent with the Han taste, or the Han worldview. And actually, just returning to this is the case here as well with Nanyue, because, it's very hard to see because it's so abstracted and so intertwined. But there are some vestiges of turtles in some of these, and maybe snakes, but There are a number of turtles on the other plaques as well from this side. We know the importance of the turtle cosmologically and otherwise in early China. So certainly the steppe visuality is now being somewhat cynicized, a term that I'm not always comfortable with, but I'm going to use it here rather frivolously for once, because we certainly have this blending, this very conscious blending, and the conscious attempt to define oneself in this very particular way. But again, with the advent of the Xiongnu, there is, with the tombs of the Xiongnu themselves, animal style undergoes perhaps the most dramatic metamorphosis. And you can already detect what that is by looking at this plaque. So there is also a desire on the part of the Xiongnu themselves to be seen, to reconcile two distinct identities. On the one hand, the identity of a proper successor to an uninterrupted steppe nomadic tradition, which would demand the inclusion of animal style, right? If one is to fashion themselves as a proper steppe elite, animal style being deposited in the tomb is a must. So that is still the case, sort of, but the other, this balancing act also depends on the construction of a second identity, and that is the identity of a reliable trade partner and a worldly politician. And to do that, they are sort of making themselves more legible, more easy to read, because I think you will all agree that to interact with a number of power players in Eurasian antiquity, these convoluted zoomorphic designs and the syncretic Antwerp trope is not always going to catch on, right, for a prolonged period of time. So their solution to that is to actually start including narrative scenes. And so in the Xiongnu period, starting from really, I would say, the 2nd century BCE, but this really becomes the case with the advent of the first millennium, you start to see emphasis on narration, but also the insertion of human figures in this. Now, human figures had never been present in the eastern part of the steppe. We see it actually, of course, with the Greco-Scythian domain, for reasons that are obvious because of Greece. But here, this is rather surprising, right? So we have narration, an illustration of some narrative scene, transportation, different vehicles, and sometimes they're Han-style chariots even. So those types of objects are now actively deposited in the tombs of Xiongnu elites in the Transbaikal area, which is in South Siberia, in Ordos, a zone that's very familiar to us, and really across the Chinese northern periphery. Yes, sometimes they still have those incomprehensible hodgepodges of different whimsical animal bodies, yes, but they are usually deposited, or more often than not deposited alongside these types of objects. So what does this rather eclectic material actually tell us? I actually argue that it poses very interesting questions, and it gives rise to several, I would say, understudied avenues of inquiry. So firstly, they reveal a certain psychology of mobility that one cannot quite find in the zoomorphic design of societies that adopted the agrarian model. So can we then perhaps talk about the creation of an alternative reality, or an alternative ecological reality during particularly tumultuous periods, right? So in one of the chapters of my book, and I didn't have time to talk about it, I in fact talked at length about how when there is climate uncertainty, when there is infighting, when there are different clashes between different clans, we start to see particularly whimsical or surprisingly, shockingly fragmented monsters, right? So that psychology of mobility, how is it reflected in these types of images? The other thing that I like to talk about actually at length is the way the so-called political elite nucleus defines itself through the strategic use and deposition of zoomorphic design, such as animal style, in the nomadic world. For the most part, the so-called confederations, right, the Scythians, the Saka, the Xiongnu, and so on and so forth, were loose and reluctant alliances of ethnically and culturally diverse peoples that came together in the face of a shared geopolitical enemy or potential trade partner, and because of shared economic interests and challenges rooted in pastoralism and trade. And as such, they needed a bonding mechanism, right? They needed to construct a collective memory. And so in many ways, this reminds me of Reinhard Westnuss and his take on the early Germanic tribes of the migration period, who similarly came together through invented notions of a kernel of tradition, so to speak. So animal style in many ways became that much needed kernel of tradition, that much needed bonding mechanism in societies that were, for the most part, inherently unstable, right? So imagine these zoomorphic arrangements that I just talked about, coupled with the reflectivity of gold being featured during a burial, during a funerary ceremony. Both Samatian in his chronicles and Herodotus especially at length, Ctesias to some degree also, and Pliny not really, but a little bit indirectly, detail the fact that all of these funerals of high-ranking members of the elite nucleus, the self-appointed elite nucleus, would have been attended by members of different clans, potential successors, not just friends, not just peers, but rivals, active rivals to whoever was the deceased, to whoever had passed. And so this was a very critical time to feature two things. One's belonging to an uninterrupted steppe nomadic tradition through zoomorphism, and therefore underline one's legitimacy as a steppe warrior and as a steppe leader, but also one's vast network of connections and worldliness, and therefore one's political leadership and achievements through these foreign objects. So what does animal style do for us? Well, epistemologically, it sort of helps us really understand the purpose of these zoomorphic spectacles, as I call them, which were more often than not inherently political and helped sort of rekindle that waning, the flames of that lingering, the flames of that waning agency of the deceased. The idea of governable otherness in particular is very interesting because it seems that more often than not, Persia and China in particular like to take very specific select elements of animal style and frame it within quintessentially Chinese and Persian formats. To what end? To whose benefit was that made? And this brings the question of audience, which I'm very interested in, on a more philosophical and practical standpoint, actually, because as we know, if these burials, and we know that to be the case from written sources, if these burials were attended by potential rivals, by members of different clans that didn't necessarily get along with each other, then it's not only the afterlife audience that has been prioritized in studies of funerary cultures that matters. It's really the tangible, real life, real world audience present at the burial that became the unsuspecting co-author of that zoomorphic rhetorical practice of creating that spectacle. And so that in itself is really important as we sort of revisit these funerary materials. But the last avenue of inquiry is something I'm working on now. So I thought maybe I should share it very briefly in 2 minutes. The later stages. So I sort of allude to this in the last chapter of my book, but I don't go to the Mongol period because, one reviewer hated it, so I removed it, honestly. But it's just a separate study, honestly. It just doesn't fit this temporal scope. But it's an interesting phenomenon because in certain parts of the Mongol Empire, starting from really in the early 14th century, and by certain parts I mean the westernmost part of the Mongol Empire, the so-called Golden Horde, we actually see the conscious reinvigoration, the sudden, almost overnight renaissance of animal style after centuries of waning. Now, animal style sort of really disappears beyond the 5th century. It's still active in certain places on the Eurasian steppe, but more often than not, we no longer see that as a trans-Eurasian phenomenon. We just don't. Yet suddenly, with the advent of the Mongols, with the Mongol hegemony, we actually see an attempt of the early Mongols of the so-called Golden Horde, who were faced with a very, very, very complex and unique demographic problem and legitimacy challenge, to use animal style to resolve that issue. So the Golden Horde, the rulers were Mongols, but they had conquered the steppe, the part of the steppe that was already the domain of Turkic nomads. So you have ethnically diverse nomads sort of vying for control, and the Mongols trying to establish control over a different, ethnically different nomadic entity. On top of that, the Golden Horde part of the Mongol Empire was in fact surrounded. While it had the Eurasian steppe as its core, its geographical core, it was surrounded by several sedentary civilizations, sedentary peoples, including indigenous Siberian peoples, including religiously diverse entities, including some Russians, in fact, who were Orthodox. So they were facing a really interesting demographic phenomenon, right? How to unify people who did not really share a religion, they didn't have a shared ethnicity, but also didn't even share an economic model. They were not all pastoral nomads. So at the very beginning, we see an explosion of these images, and sometimes even replicas, not these in particular, but exact replicas of the Iron Age animal style. And so that in itself becomes an interesting phenomenon, because that only happens in the early stages of the Mongol Empire, when they were still trying to firmly establish their control. But once that happens, they actually abandon animal style once again and opt for more cosmopolitan inventories, including Islamic objects. We started observing actually objects from Europe, including German glass, textiles from all over Europe, in fact. Byzantine textiles, for example, have been excavated from the Golden Horde, and a number of objects that have nothing to do with the steppe. The last thing I wanted to say is that once the Black Death hits the Mongol Empire, and many of these artificially constructed cities on the western part of the steppe in the Golden Horde are ravaged by the pandemic overnight, we see a lot of populations returning to nomadism and once again embracing animal style for the capital, right, the financial value of it, because they could carry it on their person and use it for safe passage as they were fleeing the pandemic, but also as a token of inherently nomadic identity. So that's interesting, because during particularly tumultuous periods, nomads throughout, way beyond Eurasia BCE, are still returning sporadically to animal style as a token of what is inherently nomadic and what is inherently steppe. Okay, and I end here. Thank you. Thank you.